Hello everybody. So this week we are looking into data collection with reference to primary research and secondary research. I'm your module leader, Dr. Xiangping Du. So referring back to Saunders' the research area, as you can see, data collection is one of the core elements, and it is one of the most important part in your research. And obviously all the outliers, we have discussed them in the past few weeks, and they all guide you in terms of the way how you collect the data. So the roadmap for research projects also indicated do your field work and collect the data is one of the most important stage before you finish your research project. Yes, and obviously for this module and for the purpose of your research proposal, you are not going to physically collect the data, but you need to plan, plan out and design the way how would you like to collect the data for your final major research project. So referring to another research process diagram, and here under collect data, you have plan and conduct data collection. As we mentioned earlier, so for the purpose of this module and for your research proposal, the 70% assessment, you need to talk about how you plan to collect the data. Okay, you don't have to physically do it, but you plan. What is your plan? How are you going to collect the data, and what kind of data you are collecting? So it's the plan, and you have to explain how you are planning to collect the data. So in order to decide, or plan out how you collect the data, you have to think about whether your research is primary research or secondary research, okay? So primary research is where you're collecting first-hand data by yourself as a researcher, okay? And while if your research is secondary research, so obviously you're researching into the data that has already been collected by others. So this diagram kind of clearly identifies the difference and the overlap of primary research and secondary research. So primary self-conducted, secondary is not self-conducted, it's already conducted by other people. So primary research is often necessary to answer specific questions because you conduct the research and going to collect the data addressing on your research question. Okay, it's you as a researcher designing the research question and designing the way how you are going to collect the data. Okay, so while for secondary research is where it's necessary to understand what the research has already been done or has been conducted, because you have to understand what other people have written down, whether that addresses your research question or how relevant that is. Yes, you might need to be a bit selective there. And again, another aspect for primary research, it can require a bit budget or timing, or more effort in that. And more time. But for secondary research, it's normally pretty cheap and quick, isn't it? So although some of the databases you may have to purchase, so which you may not have to, but it's relatively quick because it's known as desk research. You just do the research, sitting in front of a computer, and then you gather all the data that has already been collected by other people. So it's important to understand now. You think about, am my research going to be primary or secondary? And if the primary, so you as the researcher, how are you going to collect the first-hand data? And if it's secondary research, and you think, oh my God, what kind of data I'm going to need for my research, to address on my research questions. So besides the type of research, either primary or secondary research as a whole, so we mentioned the concept of data. So you may come across with the concept of data as well. So for primary research, you would definitely require primary data, okay? So data refers to the facts or figures that are relevant to a research problem, so to help you to interpret the research question you have set up, okay? And obviously for primary data, that refers to the facts or figures that's newly collected for your research project and by you as the researcher, and for secondary data refers to the facts or figures that's collected by other people already, and recorded somewhere that is accessible to you and to be used in your research project. So primary data and secondary data is another concept that you refer to, okay? And obviously it's very likely primary research involves you collecting primary data, and obviously secondary research, So it involves you collecting secondary data. But however, it's important to note your primary research may also involve some secondary data as well, because you may want to compare contrast what you have found in comparison with what other researchers have found. Okay. And the secondary data, in a more specific way, can include internal data or external data. So secondary data, where internal data refers to the data that is available within an organization, a company, or a firm. Yes, so this is internal. But it's secondary because it's not collected by you as a researcher addressing your research question in particular, is it? It's already been collected by other people for other purposes. So therefore, it's known as secondary data. But because it's this kind of data is within an organization, as normally it's kind of a property of them, they don't necessarily want disclosed to the public. So therefore, we call them internal data. Things like the company's annual report, financial statement or meeting minutes, or some kind of particular files, or their customer's letter, or the customer's list, contact list, or the sales call recording or report. And obviously, some of the data may be publicly available on their website or in other public domains, but some information might remain as their private property. Okay, and in contrast with the internal data, with reference to secondary data, another kind of data is external data, which is outside of a firm or company organization. It may not necessarily belong to the company. So for example, the government census report, the trade union related report, or magazines or journals, or business periodicals, or internet-based report, or what you've been using, for example, nowadays, all the resources that is available on the online library, on the university's library platform, so these are all the external data, and the secondary data, but it's not kind of confined within a particular organization, so it's kind of available to the public mostly. So primary data includes two kinds of data as well, if you specify them. So one's called or known as observational data. So where you are going to collect the data, so the primary first-hand data. So you can just by watching. So for example, which is observation, we know it. So for example, it's kind of observation, as we said, you may observe how people behave in a particular circumstances, so which is known as observation research strategy we've mentioned before. It can be a specific data collection method as well. So personal approach, you do it by yourself, you observe what people do under these circumstances and what people do under different circumstances. And it could be mechanical or electronic approach as well. So for example, I've seen my colleague once did this eye tracking. Observation. So obviously it's not you to look at what the people's eye moving when they see an advertisement, for example. It's a kind of the participant has been given a pair of glasses, special glasses, and then this pair of glasses tracks the human beings or the participants' eye movement and how long the eye has focused on a particular angle or particular area of this advertisement. So, whichever color, for example. So that is where we call it, is a kind of a observational data. So the data they collected using that approach is very mechanical, isn't it? So using a particular tool. So it's not you as a researcher observing where the eye moves, which would be very difficult to track as well, isn't it? How long the eyes stared at one particular angle, or area or the other. So in terms of primary data, you may collect the data by just observing personally or using particular technical tools, or the other data known as questionnaire data is by asking people. Instead of watching, you're asking. So you're speaking to people. So one type is face-to-face, asking people, like face-to-face interviews, or focus groups where you are the facilitator, facilitate the focus group discussions. Another way nowadays, which is very often, is called internet-mediated questionnaire data, isn't it? And I think under the current government regulation. So you are not allowed, or the ethics committee would not allow you to go out to meet people face to face to get this data by asking them. Yeah, so you have to organize this data, the whole data collection process using internet. Yeah, so for example, it could be, as we mentioned before, it could be Zoom, could be Teams you are very familiar with, or it could be just simple Skype call, or WhatsApp call as well. Yes, it's got, which is known as internet mediated. So I think this diagram, which is clearly illustrated you what do we mean by data, and then what do we mean by primary data, secondary data, and how can we obtain primary and secondary data, and what are they knowing? So they've given different names. Okay, so obviously different research questions lead to different kind of research, either primary or secondary, and also lead to the requirement of different kind of data. Yeah, and obviously this table demonstrate the differences between the primary data and secondary data, what they mean, and then, for example, primary data is the data collected by the researcher, him or herself, which is you, and the secondary data is collected by other people, which is already existed there, and you have access to them. Okay, and obviously for primary data, in terms of originality, primary data is original, isn't it? It's unique to you and to your research, while secondary data is not. And accuracy, primary data is probably more accurate because you are the researcher. You are likely to be the administrator of an executor and conductor of the data collection. Yeah, the primary data. So it would be more highly accurate than the secondary data, which probably not as specific to your research question, as your primary data. The relevance, similarly, primary data will be very relevant because it's specifically designed to answer your research questions, while secondary research is designed for other purposes, so that may not be as relevant. So in terms of control, and obviously for primary data, you have more control, because you decide how long this will spend, what question to navigate first and second, for example. But for secondary data, you have no control. Okay, and ownership as well. So if you collect primary data, you have the ownership of the data, and which belongs to your research. Yeah, and obviously you would have ethics to say what the data will be used for. So very likely you only use this data for your own research, not any other purposes, but still you own the data, you have got the ethics for it. Okay, but for secondary data, you don't own them to you, there's no ownership to you. In terms of cost and time, so primary data, as we mentioned, is likely to be more expensive, time consuming, while secondary data probably is less so. Accessibility, so for primary data, they are not freely or easily available to the public. So in terms of accessibility, whether other people can have access to your data, so which is very likely no, because as we said, you have already got the ethics, yeah, got the participant consent, and you agree to them. You would not reveal or release the data to any other people or their personal information. But for secondary data, it is available to the public. Yeah, so everything's already published. In terms of the sources, for primary data, the source, where they are from, for example, for primary data, either from the observational data or the asking kind of data, questionnaire kind of data. It could be from surveys, observations, experiments, interviews, as we mentioned, yeah. And while for secondary data, the sources could be, internal record from a company or a firm, and it could be the government or industry related reports or data. Okay, this is just to give you an idea of the differences and for you to understand. We touched upon the term sources in the last slide. What do we mean by source? Source is where the things are from, yeah? So where it's originated. When we talk about primary data, the sources could be from surveys, from questionnaires, observations, or interviews, yeah? So those are known as probably primary source. Okay, so there comes the term as primary, secondary, or tertiary sources. So what is the source of your data? And then I think it's not very important for you, to know all these terms to be used in your research proposal or your final research project, but at least you need to understand them, because at at times that you may come across with them, or you may want to include them in your research proposal or your final research project to demonstrate your clear understanding of the kind of data you require or you collect, and the kind of research you conduct, and the kind of sources you have obtained the data from. Okay, so this kind of a three-pillar illustrates the concept definition of the three sources and the characteristics of them and the example of them as well. Okay, just very briefly going through them. Primary sources are referring to the raw data, so original source of information that before it being analyzed or published is also original. So for example, the characteristics are the first-hand information, okay, first-hand, for example, observation, as we mentioned, or the contemporary account of an event or viewpoints at the time. So these are the primary sources. Examples are the interviews as the source, speeches, diaries, birth certificates, journal articles, newspaper articles written at a time is kind of the source that you get the primary data, isn't it? So from what source you can get the primary data? From interviews, from speeches, from diaries, from the birth certificate, even journal articles. These are all the primary source where you get the original or primary data from. Okay, so while secondary source, as in the middle column, refers to the sources that analyzes, interprets primary data already. Yeah, so where the data you collected from the primary source has already been analyzed or interpreted, and they don't offer any new evidence. Yeah, and obviously characteristics is the interpretation of the information written after the event or offer reviews or critiques after that, okay, which is secondary source. So I think it's likely, for example, if you see a painting, yes, painting itself can be served as a primary source, give you a lot of information, isn't it? So you can say that, and you can say this painting is the primary source, but if people made commentary on this painting, that will be the secondary source, isn't it? So like, as we said, it's kind of interpretation of the information or of this particular painting. Yeah, the examples of the secondary source are the biographies, for example, and journal articles, written on a particular topic, the textbooks, which has interpreted a lot of other things, collated information together, commentaries, as we mentioned, on an event, on a piece of art, on a particular person, on a particular event. Yeah, editorials as well, collating different information in one, and literary criticisms as well, critique or something. Okay, so these are secondary sources. If you say your data is from secondary source, from journal articles, this is from secondary sources. Yeah, so tertiary source, as illustrated here in the last column, refers to the sources that compiles data on a particular topic. And then tertiary source, what that means is where it's kind of collections or list of primary and secondary sources or reference work, finding tools for sources. It may not necessarily offer you the information or the data you require, but kind of like as it says, like a finding tool. Yeah, so from here, and you go find the relevant information, find the relevant data. So for example, it could be the bibliography. You see a bibliography or list of reference, and that doesn't give you anything, does it? But from this bibliography or reference list, and it directs you to find the book, which is the secondary source. And then from the book, you read somebody's interview script, and then the interview kind of quotations or transcript is the primary sources now, and then the book is the secondary source, where the reference list and the bibliography is the tertiary source, isn't it? And obviously it has quite a list of examples here, encyclopedias, bibliographies or references, abstracts, indexes, literature reviews, library catalogs, databases, like what we have online library, as we said, we use is a tertiary source, isn't it? Because it doesn't really offer you anything. You need to type in whatever topic you need to find out, and then lead you to the book, the secondary source, and then lead you to the content in the book. Okay, and I think it's important for you to understand, and I think a lot of the time you may not have to define what they are in your research project, but I think you need to understand whether your research primary, research or secondary research, and then the data for your research is primary data or secondary data, but not necessarily the source. But unless you're very interested and want to explain, you can always include them as well. Okay. So I touched upon the example of a painting and the example of a reference as a tertiary source, and then you go into a book as a secondary source, and then you found somebody's interview quotations or transcript in the book as the primary source. And obviously there's a few examples and comparison of 3 different sources in quite a number of different disciplines, which I have here for you. And I think it's important for you to have a look at it because MSc IB research project, for your final research project or for your research topic, you may choose research topic in different different areas. It's kind of, as we said, it's kind of a interdisciplinary areas. Now you may look into the art or architect area, or you may look into humanities, include letters or kind of resources in that area. So on the very right hand side, I have put it down some kind of a primary source in business context. For example, labels, packages, these are the primary source, isn't it? And from the label, you may analyze the label, the color, the size, or the packages, for example. Okay, and then from that, you may come across with a secondary source where there's a critique on the labeling of a particular product or the packages of a particular product. Critique saying it's too much info or too much packages, not environmentally friendly kind of thing. And then you may come with a tertiary source where there's a databases of all kind of different labels. So I think hopefully you can kind of relate or understand a little bit more about primary, secondary, tertiary sources. And the primary sources in business context could be diaries, blogs, or product website views, for example, on Facebook sales section, and the people post their views or post purchase reviews, and then that is primary source, isn't it? But if somebody have used it in they can use that in their research, and then this is the primary source, and then you put in your research, and that is the secondary data, isn't it? But it's a primary source, isn't it? Pattern emails, interviews, biographies, transcript, posters, these are all kind of different primary sources in business context. Okay, so understanding can be a bit confusing to understand the concept of research data and sources, or primary, secondary research, primary, secondary data, primary, secondary sources. And as I mentioned, it's not as important whether you have to include it in your writing, but it's important for you to understand what they are, distinguish what kind of research you're doing. So for primary research, for example, it must involve the collection of primary data by you as a researcher. So you may include as many secondary data as you need, but there must be an element where you as the researcher have collected first-hand primary data at some point in your research. Okay, and it's very likely the sources are from primary sources, and not all the primary sources, like as we said in the diaries done by other people, or the painting done by other people. So the primary sources involves you, the researcher, in that, like the interviews, surveys, or the experiment observations we mentioned. Okay, and by contrast, the secondary research refers to the collection of secondary data. It could be internal data, which could be not being published, for example, but that is not you collected. So must include only secondary data, and the sources could be primary, secondary, or tertiary. Must be secondary and tertiary, obviously, because it has been interpreted, processed by other people. So some primary sources, again, as we said, excluding all those ones we mentioned under primary research, those diaries, this kind of interview has already done by other people. Okay. Now let's move on to another important concept, which is method. So for primary research or secondary research, and then you may, as we seen from the Saunders Research Onion, there's a term method referred, data collection method. So obviously, as we mentioned, method is the most important inner core you must understand. For no matter your research primary or secondary, you need to understand what is your method. Yeah, so the term method refers to the tools, techniques, or instruments you employ in your research to collect the data. Yeah, and also for data collection method is where or how the data is collected by you as a researcher. So for primary research method, the tools you're using or the techniques you're using for your primary research or you're collecting the primary data is what we mentioned earlier: surveys, questionnaires, interviews, experiment, observations, or focus groups. Yeah, and for secondary research method, or the tools or the instruments you're using to collect the secondary data are, as we mentioned, the research report, journals, online library you're using currently, different databases, government report or organization report, or the product reviews, emails, as we mentioned, product menus, the labels, the packages, and all sorts already been produced by other people. Okay. We actually have already discussed the second research before, which refers to desk research and where the researcher does not have any interaction or contact human participants or the collection of any primary data, yeah, but only deals with the data that has already been collected by other people and it is available to you and is relevant to your research. Okay, so it says obviously involves taking information from existing sources, and it could be primary, secondary, tertiary, as we mentioned, and interrogating it or the information, and then to see what they reveals and how they relate to your research and helps you to answer your research question. Yes, so obviously the secondary data is important for you to understand, the advantages, disadvantages we mentioned before. Yeah. So for secondary research, as we mentioned, it involves the collection of secondary data, and you must not be very unfamiliar now with this diagram from Saunders. And obviously they have divided secondary data into survey kind of data collected by other parties, government, organizations, or particular agency or third parties, and then documentary kind of data or multiple sources. It's mainly you kind of categorize them into organization related or trade union or government or particular third agency or particular databases or academic sort of sources as well. Yeah. So we will talk about primary research in a more detail in a separate presentation. And obviously for this week, what you need to understand, besides all the different concepts, is the concept of primary and secondary research. And then you just need to understand whether your research primary and secondary, what the methods you need to adopt for the collection of the data you require to answer your research question. Yeah, so all the different methods here for primary research and for secondary research, we have touched upon quite a few earlier. And obviously, this image is a kind of summary of the kind of data involved. Yeah, primary research, secondary research, the kind of data where you are, you positioned, the data collection process. I think this is a nice illustration which can help you to understand the primary research, secondary research, primary data, primary and secondary and tertiary sources. Okay, and obviously, it's important for you to understand the benefits, advantages, and limitations of both primary, secondary research, which I think are vital to be included in your presentation if you don't have to specify the kind of data or sources in your research. And every time in your writing, justify why your research primary, why your research secondary, and whether you have considered all the advantages, disadvantages, and justify the choice of for your research, whether it's primary or secondary. Okay. And again, feel free to do the reading and then listen to the lecture or look at the slides and then engage with the case studies and then think about your research and how does this week's presentation of primary research and the secondary research relate to you. How would you adopt whether your research primary and secondary, and it's important how you relate all this information and then apply to your personal research. Okay.